It's no secret that Nazi Germany carried out some of the most brutal experiments in history. At Dachau, prisoners were injected with malaria, plunged into freezing water, and dissected alive. These experiments revealed almost nothing but how far the human body could be pushed before breaking, and the nature of quote-unquote following orders. Yet after the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union recruited Nazi scientists because they did far more than experiment on humans, using their expertise in rocketry, medicine, and physics. Although the Reich collapsed in 1945, its scientists lived on in the service of new masters. In both Washington and Moscow, former Nazis were placed into rocket programs, weapons labs, and military research. The same war that confirmed human cruelty ended with two superpowers racing to perfect a weapon capable of destroying the world. This was definitely one of the darkest chapters in human history, and to understand it, we have to go back in time, before all the rallies and promises of national revival were part of the same system as gas chambers, forced marches, and cities reduced to rubble. One of the biggest Nazi symbols was a man who wasn't even born in Germany. He was born in Austria, the same man who had once gone to school for painting and served in World War I, where he witnessed atrocity, went on to be a leading cause of atrocity and one of, if not the most famous fascist leaders. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, Germany was still recovering from the First World War and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. Millions were unemployed, the economy was unstable, and national pride was severely hurt. After failing to gain a majority on many occasions, the Nazi Party gained a majority in 1932. The Nazi Party instantly started indoctrination when they came to power. Children joined the Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth, or the Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls, where they learned loyalty to Hitler before loyalty to family. Adults were no less targeted. Radio ownership exploded after the Nazis produced the cheap Volksempfänger, a receiver designed to capture Hitler's speeches in state broadcasts. Independent newspapers vanished. But why do this? Though simplified, I can tell you that Hitler and the Nazis began indoctrination because they believed controlling how people thought from childhood was the only way to secure absolute loyalty and prevent opposition. Their vision was to create a Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, of racially pure, obedient Germans who would serve the state, fight for expansion, and accept Hitler as the unquestioned Führer. Many of his ideas and enforcement tactics were shaped by his experience in the military, as well as the anti-Semitic movements which were present long before the Nazi power, and, in my opinion, his passion for art and architecture also played a role in his ideas. He must have thought that he could somehow sculpt his own society in his truly own crazed way. Hitler promised a 1,000-year Reich, a new civilization where Germans would dominate Europe. As an art enthusiast himself, he had a vision of what this would look like physically. Albert Speer, a German architect, drew plans for vast boulevards, stadiums, and the famous Volkshalle, a dome so massive it would have had its own weather system. At the time, terror became omnipresent. The Gestapo, or secret police, encouraged neighbors to denounce one another, creating a climate of fear. Dissenters disappeared into prisons or early concentration camps like Dachau, first opened in 1933. In 1937, for example, Gestapo files from Würzburg show that about 57% of all investigations came from citizen denunciations, so you never ever felt safe. But the question was never who was safe, it was what is safe. Like in terms of countries, Germany annexed Austria in 1938 and Czechoslovakia in 1939, which then escalated with other factors into World War II with the attack on Poland in September 1939, followed by rapid conquest of Denmark, Norway, and the Low Countries, and then France by mid-1940. By 1941, Hitler's big plan was to dominate Europe, crush Britain through blockade and air war, and launch Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union to seize land and resources for his envisioned empire. The envisioned empire was to come at the cost of millions of lives. Not only the soldiers dying for the Vaterland, but also Jewish people and other minorities. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, trains arrived daily. Deportees, often after days without food or water, were pushed onto the platform. A doctor pointed left or right, labor or death. Families were torn apart in seconds. Those deemed unfit for work were marched directly into the gas chambers, disguised as showers. Zyklon B pellets were dropped in, killing hundreds at a time. Crematoria burned the corpses day and night, their smoke visible for kilometers. Survivor testimonies rarely capture horrific details. One Jewish survivor recalled how hunger destroyed the human spirit. We are slaves, deprived of every right, exposed to every insult, condemned to certain death. Another survivor described the first night in the camp. Never shall I forget the smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of children whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath the sky. The camps were not limited to Jews. Roma were exterminated in parallel as well as other minorities. Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions in brutal conditions, and disabled people were killed in the T4 program, where doctors filled out paperwork to decide who would live and who would be sent to the gas chamber. Day-to-day life in concentration camps was the slow destruction of humanity itself. Prisoners rose at dawn, often to stand in roll carts for hours in the freezing cold. Food consisted of watery soup and crusts of bread. Work crews carried heavy stones, dug ditches, or dismantled buildings. Some prisoners were subjected to experiments. At Dachau, inmates were frozen in ice water to test survival times for Luftwaffe pilots. At Ravensbrück, women were deliberately infected with gangrene and operated on without anesthesia. Joseph Mengele, the infamous angel of death at Auschwitz, conducted experiments on twins, injecting chemicals into their eyes or surgically mutilating them, often leading to death. By 1943, Germany's victories had turned into defeats. They had made the same mistake Napoleon made, as well as many others. The first of their many mistakes was invading Russia in winter, and second of all was invading Russia in the first place. It's never a good idea. As the right crumbled, the brutality intensified. Camps were evacuated in death marches. Prisoners who were already emancipated were forced to march hundreds of kilometers in winter, shot dead if they collapsed. Villages were burned as the SS attempted to erase evidence of the crimes. When Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, they found mountains of corpses, warehouses filled with shoes and hair, and survivors reduced to skeletal figures. General Eisenhower, upon seeing Ohrdruf, ordered photographers to document everything, ordering the infamous words, "The world must see and know." There is another thing the world must see, though. Nazi crimes rightly dominate a lot of our historical memory. We must learn from history so that we don't repeat it. But it overshadows atrocities committed elsewhere during the same period that receive far less attention. In British-ruled India, for example, the Bengal famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people. Crops failed, but food exports continued. Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister, diverted grain to British troops and to build reserves in Europe. Nothing can be excused, but we must learn history and not specific parts of history that we choose to focus our attention on. Because for every atrocity, there is another one not recognized, which exposes human nature. I, like many of you, will ask yourselves time and time again, how can a human do such a thing? How can they be part of something like this? Understanding the psychology of Nazi Germany means looking not only at Hitler and his inner circle, but at ordinary citizens, soldiers, and the leaders who participated or enabled atrocity. We will look into them and their mindset. Research by Robert Gelati in his work Backing Hitler 2001 and Ian Kershaw shows that many Germans internalized Nazi propaganda less out of fanaticism than out of social pressure and perceived benefit. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, probably the most referred to study when the eternal question of just following orders comes up, also exposes something. Conducted in the 1960s, he showed how average individuals could commit harmful and fatal acts upon other humans when instructed by authority, which I went into detail on in my video on the Japanese Empire's Unit 731, a brutal human experimentation site. Omer Bartov's work, Hitler's Army 1991, documents how the brutal conditions on the Eastern Front fused survival instincts with indoctrination. Soldiers were taught that the war against the Soviet Union was a war of annihilation, and dehumanizing propaganda about Jews and Slavs made massacre seem part of military duty. They were under the influence of propaganda when they signed up for the military, and once they were sent to the front they had to survive. There wasn't really time to contemplate whether it's right or wrong, though this does not excuse it. Fascism is a political system built on dictatorship. In a nutshell, it works by uniting people through fear, propaganda, and the promise of national rebirth. But it fails because it relies on perpetual conflict, suppresses dissent, and collapses once military or economic power breaks down. In Nazi Germany, this meant temporary unity and control under one leader, but inevitable destruction when war and resources turned against them. With that behind the Nazis, though I simplified and there is a lot more to the story, the question of how radical groups did not gain power after the Second World War, completing the pattern, and how Germany made a quick recovery to become the largest economy in Europe, also needs to be asked. Now, although it is complex, I think there are many things that would contribute to the answer. Denazification is in the center. After 1945, the Allies attempted to reprogram German society, at least the part that they controlled. In the American zone, nearly 8 million Germans were screened. Public show trials, re-education programs, and new school curriculum tried to break the old myths. Yet, historians like Norbert Frey argue that denazification often failed in depth. Many Nazis returned to public life in the 1950s, and they didn't only show up in Germany. I also wholeheartedly believe that a lot of the German people were in a state of shame and shock, as if waking up from a bad dream, but not all. And no matter how many apologies, there is no righting the wrong. We have to accept that it happened and learn from it, just like any time in history.